From its very beginning, the American Revolutionary War was, necessarily, a showcase for asymmetric techniques. In the 1920s, Harold Murdoch of Boston attempted to solve the puzzle of the first shots fired on Lexington Green, and came to the suspicion that the few score militiamen who gathered before sunrise to await the arrival of hundreds of well-prepared British soldiers were sent specifically to provoke an incident which could be used for propaganda purposes. The return of the British force to Boston following the search operations at Concord was subject to constant skirmishing, using partisan forces gathered from communities all along the route, making maximum use of the terrain, particularly trees and stone field walls, to overcome the limitations of their weapons, muskets with an effective range of only about 50 to 70 meters. Throughout the war, skirmishing tactics against British troops on the move continued to be a key factor in Patriot success. However, they may also have encouraged the occasional incidents, particularly in the later stages, where British troops used alleged surrender violations as a justification for killing large numbers of captives, for example Wogs Haw and Groton Heights. Another feature of the Long March from Concord was the urban warfare technique of using buildings along the route as additional cover for snipers, which provoked the logical response from the British force: destruction of the buildings. When revolutionary forces forced their way into Norfolk, Virginia, and used waterfront buildings as cover for shots at British vessels out on the river, the response of destruction of those buildings was ingeniously used to the advantage of the rebels, who encouraged the spread of fire throughout the largely loyalist town, and spread propaganda blaming it on the British. Shortly afterwards they destroyed the remaining houses, on the grounds that they might provide cover for British soldiers. On the subject of propaganda, it should be borne in mind that, contrary to the impression given in the popular U.S. movies, British forces never adopted a popular response to partisan-style asymmetric warfare. Retribution massacres of groups selected on a semi-random basis from the population at large. The rebels also adopted a form of asymmetric sea warfare, by using small, fast vessels to avoid the Royal Navy, and capturing or sinking large numbers of merchant ships. However, the British responded by issuing letters of marque permitting private armed vessels to undertake reciprocal attacks on enemy shipping. John Paul Jones became notorious in Britain for his expedition from France in the little sloop of war Ranger in April 1778, during which, in addition to his attacks on merchant shipping, he made 2 landings on British soil. The effect of these raids, particularly when coupled with his capture of the Royal Navy's HMS Drake, the first such success in British waters, but not Jones's last, was to force the British government to increase resources for coastal defense, and to create a climate of fear among the British public, which was subsequently fed by press reports of his preparations for the 1779 Bonhomme-Richard mission. From 1776, the conflict turned increasingly into a proxy war on behalf of France, following a strategy proposed in the 1760s but initially resisted by the idealistic young King Louis XVI, who came to the throne at the age of 19 a few months before Lexington. France also encouraged proxy wars against the British in India, but ultimately drove itself to the brink of state bankruptcy by entering the wars directly, on several fronts throughout the world. The later entry of Spain and the Dutch Republic into the war, against Britain but not for America, effectively reversed the asymmetry, most obviously from August to October 1781, and an interesting aspect of this war is what might be described as an asymmetric peace, in which America and Spain received almost everything they demanded, but were forced into conflict with each other, while France and the Dutch Republic both did so badly that they suffered total state collapse within a few years. The revolutionary government which emerged from the French state collapse in 1789 became notorious for the reign of terror in which thousands of opponents of the state, or of individuals claiming loyalty to the state, were executed. In 1793 a counter-revolutionary movement arose in the Vendée region of western France, which very effectively used against the government forces the sort of tactics seen in the American Revolution. The official response to this was at the time called populicide, the extermination of the rebel race, though good citizens were to be sent out of harm's way. Announcing a genocidal intent proved to be counterproductive, as the rebels were left with no choices but to kill or be killed, a fact which the government realized in the spring of 1794 after 12 columns of soldiers had been sent through the area, committing a wide variety of atrocities but failing to stop the revolt. The government's willingness to kill so many of its own citizens without trial was also a factor in its own brutal end in July 1794. The Second Boer War was the first major war of the 20th century and one in which asymmetric warfare featured prominently. After an initial phase, which was fought by both sides as a conventional war, the British captured Johannesburg, the Boers' largest city, and captured the capitals of the two Boer republics. The British then expected the Boers to accept peace as dictated by the victors in the traditional European way. However, instead of capitulating, the Boers fought a protracted guerrilla war. Between 20 and 30,000 Boer commandos were only defeated after the British brought to bear 450,000 troops, about 10 times as many as were used in the conventional phase of the war. During this phase, the British introduced internment in concentration camps for the Boer civilian population and also implemented a scorched earth policy. Later, the British began using blockhouses built within machine gun range of one another and flanked by barbed wire to slow the Boers' movement across the countryside and block paths to valuable targets. Such tactics eventually evolved into today's counter-insurgency tactics. The Boer commando raids deep into the Cape Colony, which were organized and commanded by Jan Smuts, resonated throughout the century as the British and others adopted and adapted the tactics used by the Boer commandos in later conflicts. The end of World War II established the two most powerful victors, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, as the two dominant world superpowers. Various conflicts throughout Africa, Latin America and Asia throughout the Cold War saw the US and allies and USSR and allies supporting their proxies financially and militarily. A smaller example of war by proxy was East Germany's covert support for the Red Army faction, which was active from 1968 and carried out a succession of terrorist attacks in West Germany during the 1970s and to a lesser extent in the 1980s. After German reunification in 1990, it was discovered that the RAF had received financial and logistic support from the Stasi, the Security and Intelligence Organization of East Germany. It had also given several RAF terrorists shelter and new identities. It had not been in the interests of either the Red Army faction or the East Germans to be seen as cooperating. The apologists for the Red Army faction argued that they were striving for a true socialist society, not the sort that existed in Eastern Europe. The East German government was involved in Ostpolitik, and it was not in its interest to be caught overtly aiding a terrorist organization operating in West Germany. In the Korean War, the Soviet Union aided the communists in North Korea and China against the United Nations forces led by the United States, but the Soviet Union did not enter the war directly. In the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union supplied North Vietnam and the Viet Cong with training, logistics and materiel, but unlike the United States Armed Forces, they fought the war through their proxies and did not enter the conflict directly. The war between the Mujahideen and the Red Army during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a classic asymmetric war. The aid given by the US to the Mujahideen during the war was only covert at the tactical level. The Reagan administration told the world that it was helping the freedom-loving people of Afghanistan. Of all the proxy wars fought by the USA against the USSR during the Cold War, this was the most cost-effective and politically successful, as it was the USSR's most humiliating military defeat, and that defeat was a contributing factor to the implosion of the Soviet Union.